She walked 12 miles through the first snow of the season to ask a stranger to marry her, and the man she found waiting at the end of that road had already decided to say no. Elena Whitlock had buried her father 3 weeks back, lost the house 2 weeks after that, and now she stood shaking on Silas Granger's porch with a dead man's letter and nothing else in the world. If you want to know whether a marriage built on debt and desperation can turn into something worth dying for, stay with me to the end. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments which town you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The wind came down off the bighorns the way it always did in late October, mean and early, carrying the kind of cold that found the gaps in a man's coat and settled in for the winter. Silas Granger had been splitting wood since before the light was good, and his hands had gone past hurting into that numb place where you could nick yourself open and not know it till you saw the red. He kept swinging anyway. There was a rhythm to it that kept his head quiet, and a quiet head was the only kind worth having out here. He was 36 years old and looked older, which was fine by him. The years had done that thing to his face where it stopped telling people anything. Folks down in Cooper's Bend called him distant when they were being polite, and worse when they weren't, and he'd never once tried to correct them. A reputation, he'd learned, did the work of a fence. It kept things out so you didn't have to. The first he knew of her was the dog. Old Pike lifted his head from the porch boards and let out a low sound. Not quite a growl, more a question. Silas straightened up, one hand still on the axe, and squinted down the long rutted track that ran from his place to the wagon road 3 miles off. There was a figure coming up it. On foot. In this cold, on foot, which meant either a fool or somebody in trouble, and out here those came to the same thing. He waited. He was good at waiting. The figure resolved slow into a woman, small, wrapped in a coat that hadn't been made for weather like this, carrying a carpet bag that banged against her leg with every step. She walked like her feet hurt. She walked like she'd been walking a long while and had decided some miles back that stopping wasn't a choice she got to make. Pike got up and trotted out to meet her, tail going, traitor that he was, and Silas set the axe head down in the chopping block and wiped his palms on his trousers and waited some more. She stopped maybe 20 feet off. Up close, she was younger than he'd guessed, pale, with dark hair coming loose from under a knit cap, and a face that had been pretty before whatever had happened to her had happened. Her lips had gone a color lips weren't supposed to be. She was breathing hard and trying not to show it. "You're Silas Granger," she said. Not a question. "I am. My father was Thomas Whitlock." The name landed in him like a stone dropped down a well. He felt the splash of it somewhere deep and old. For a second he couldn't say anything at all, and the wind filled up the space where his voice should have been. "Thomas Whitlock," he said finally. "You knew him. I owed him my life. There's a difference." Something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe, or just exhaustion finally getting its hooks all the way in. Her knees did a thing they shouldn't have, a small buckle she caught before it became a fall, and Silas was off the porch and across the yard before he'd decided to move. "Easy," he said. He got a hand under her arm. She was lighter than the carpet bag, near enough. "When'd you last eat?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked you." She didn't answer, which was an answer. But, He got her inside and into the chair by the stove and built the fire up till the iron ticked, and he put the coffee on and cut bread and the last of the smoked venison and set it in front of her without ceremony. She ate the way hungry people who'd been raised polite ate, slow, deliberate, fighting the part of herself that wanted to fall on it. He pretended not to watch. He fed Pike a scrap to give his hand something to do. The cabin wasn't much. One room, a loft, a stove that drew badly when the wind came from the north. He'd built most of it himself 8 years back and added to it the way a man adds to a thing he doesn't expect anybody else to ever see. There were no curtains. There was no second chair worth the name. She had the good one and he leaned against the wall. He was aware, in a way he hadn't been an hour ago, of how the place must look to a pair of eyes that weren't his own. "You walked from the wagon road," he said. "The man who gave me the ride wouldn't come up the track. Said his horse was tired." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I think he just didn't want to." "That's 12 miles. I counted 9 before I stopped counting." Silas almost smiled. "Almost. Where'd you come from before that?" "Laramie. Then a coach as far as my money went, which wasn't far. then whatever I could get. She looked up at him. Her eyes were her father's, that he could see now, gray, direct, the kind that didn't slide off you when things got uncomfortable. I've been 3 weeks getting here, Mr. Granger. Silas. I've been 3 weeks getting here, and I'd rather just say the thing I came to say than work up to it, if that's all right with you. He crossed his arms, bracing, though he couldn't have told you for what. Say it then. She set the cup down. She reached into the carpet bag and came out with an envelope, soft and creased from handling, the kind of soft paper gets when somebody's opened and folded it 100 times. She held it a moment like she was deciding something. Then she held it out to him. He wrote this before he died. It's got your name on it. The inside, I mean. It's addressed to you. I read it. A muscle moved in her jaw. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I read it about 40 times. Silas took the envelope. His own name was on the front in a hand he half remembered, shakier than the man he'd known would have written, the letters of somebody whose body had quit before his will did. He didn't open it, not yet. He held it and looked at her. Tell me what happened to him. So she did. Thomas Whitlock had been a horse trader and sometime guide, and 12 years back he'd come across a half-frozen, half-dead younger man named Silas Granger in a creek bottom up near the Sweetwater, where Silas had gone through ice and lost his horse and his rifle and most of his hope. Whitlock had hauled him out, built a fire that by rights shouldn't have caught in that wet, and sat up 2 nights keeping him from dying. Then he'd ridden him 40 miles to a doctor, paid the doctor out of his own pocket, and disappeared back into his own life before Silas was even clear-headed enough to thank him properly. They'd written after. Not often. Whitlock wasn't a letter-writing man, and neither was Silas. But twice a year, maybe, a few lines would come, and Silas would send a few back, and that thin thread had been about the only one Silas kept to the world outside his own fence line. He got sick in the spring, Elena said. Her voice had gone flat, the way voices do when feeling something too hard would break the telling. His lungs. The doctor in Laramie called it one thing, and the doctor we couldn't afford would have called it another, I expect. It took him slow enough that we had time to lose everything trying to keep him alive. She turned the coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. He'd put money into a freighting venture, a partner. The partner ran off with the cash and the wagons both, and by the time we understood we'd been robbed, my father was too sick to chase it, and I was too busy nursing him to. And your mother? Died when I was 11. There's just me. She said it without any play for pity in it. A fact, laid down flat. We sold the horses to pay the doctor. Then the house, to pay the men who held the note on the house, except the house didn't cover what we owed, so I still owe some of it, somewhere, to somebody. After the funeral, I had the clothes and the bag, and that letter. She nodded at the envelope in his hand. He made me promise to bring it here. He couldn't say much by the end, but he was clear about that. Take it to Granger, he said. He'll know what to do. She gave a short, tired breath that wasn't a laugh. So here I am, Mr. Granger, Silas, and I confess I don't know what you're supposed to do any more than you do. Silas looked down at the envelope. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had picked up again and was working at the eaves. He opened it. The letter wasn't long. Whitlock had never wasted words alive and hadn't started dying. Silas read it once, fast, then again slow. The man's voice came up off the paper plane as if he'd been standing in the room, that dry way he had. And Silas had to stop halfway and stand very still for a moment and look at the wall until the thing pressing at the back of his eyes agreed to stand down. What it said in the parts that mattered was this, that Whitlock was dying and knew it. That he had a daughter, Elena, who was the best of everything he'd ever made or done. That he had nothing left to leave her but a debt and a stubborn streak. And that he was asking Silas, not telling him, asking, a man's not in a position to tell when he's begging, to see that she didn't end up alone and unprotected in a country that ate alone and unprotected women alive. I never called in what you owed me, the letter said. I'm calling it now. Not money. Just this. Don't let her come to nothing. Silas folded the letter back along its soft creases. He put it in his shirt pocket over his chest, and he stood there with his hand flat against it for a second, like he was keeping it from getting out. He never told me he had a daughter, he said. He didn't tell most people much. He was private. You'd have liked... She stopped. You did like him, I suppose. Sorry. I keep talking about him like you have to be brought up to date, and you knew him longer than I've been alive, near enough. 12 years. You'd have been a child. I was. I remember a man came once when I was small. My father said you were the toughest man he ever pulled out of a river and the only one who ever wrote back. She almost smiled. The almost smile was the most alive her face had looked since she'd walked into the yard. I always pictured you bigger. Disappointing. A little, she admitted, and that small, honest dig, when she had nothing in the world and every reason to flatter the only man who might keep her from the cold. That was the first moment Silas thought maybe she'd come by more than her eyes from her father. He didn't propose anything that first night. He wasn't a fool, and he wasn't a brute, and he understood that whatever was going to happen, it wasn't going to happen with her swaying in the chair and gray with road tired. He gave her the loft and his good blanket and the spare he'd been meaning to mend. And he took the floor by the stove with Pike, and he lay awake most of the night listening to the small, unfamiliar sounds of another person breathing above him in a space that had held only his own breath for 8 years. He thought about a lot of things in the dark. He thought about Whitlock building a fire in the wet. He thought about the way the girl had said, "Take it to Granger," in her father's flattened-out voice. He thought about the freight of the word promise and how a dying man could load it onto the living and walk off into the ground, leaving them to carry it. Mostly he thought about the simple arithmetic of it. A woman alone in the territory had 3 or 4 roads, and most of them ran downhill. She could find work in a town, scrubbing or sewing or worse, and be at the mercy of whoever did the hiring. She could go back east if she had the fare, which she didn't, to people who weren't expecting her and might not want her. She could throw herself on the charity of strangers and learn what charity cost. Or she could stay here, which raised its own problem, because a man and an unmarried woman alone in a one-room cabin 3 miles up a track was a thing the country had opinions about, and the country's opinions had teeth. There was one road that solved most of it at once. He turned it over and didn't like the shape of it, and couldn't find a better one. In the morning he made breakfast, and they ate it without much talk, and then he set his cup down and said the thing the way he did most things, head on, and without dressing it up. "I've got a proposal for you," he said, "and I want you to hear the whole of it before you say anything, because the front half of it is going to sound worse than the back half." Elena went still across the table. "All right, you can't stay here the way things are. You know that, or you'll figure it. A woman under this roof who isn't kin and isn't a wife is a woman. This country's going to have a story about by Sunday, and the story won't be kind, and it'll follow you the rest of your life. I won't do that to you, and I expect you won't do it to yourself." He turned his cup in a slow circle, the same gesture she'd made the night before, though neither of them noticed. "I can't send you off with money I don't have, and I'm not going to break a promise to your father that I didn't even get the chance to make out loud." She watched him. She didn't help him along. He respected that. "So here it is. You marry me?" "Not." He held up a hand, though she hadn't moved. "Not the way that word usually means, a practical thing. Paper, a name that keeps the wolves off you, mine, for whatever it's worth out here, which is more than you'd think. You'd have the protection of being a married woman with a roof and a claim. I'd have—" He stopped, because he didn't rightly know what he'd have, and he wasn't going to lie to her in the first hour of the only honest arrangement he'd ever proposed to anybody. "I'd have done right by the only man who ever did right by me. That's the bones of it. The rest, the way 2 people who are married usually, the rest stays your choice, always, and there's a loft and there's a floor, and I've slept on worse than this floor most of my life." The fire ticked. Pike sighed and resettled. Outside, a magpie was working at something on the woodpile, rattling on about it. Elena was quiet a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful. "You're asking me to marry a man I met yesterday." "I am. To solve a problem. To solve about 4 problems. But yes, and you don't want—" She gestured, a small awkward motion that took in the cabin, the loft, the whole loaded shape of the thing. Color came up in her cheeks for the first time, the first real color he'd seen in her face. "You're not asking for that." "I'm not asking for anything I'd have to ask for," Silas said. "If that makes sense. I figure a thing like that's not worth having unless it's freely given, and I'm not in the business of putting a woman in a corner where she's got to give what she'd rather not. You'd be safe here. That's a word I mean. Safe from the country and safe from me both." She looked at him for a long time. He let her. He'd laid it all out, and there wasn't anything to do now but stand still, under her looking, and let her decide what kind of man she'd walk 12 miles to find. "Why?" she said finally. "And don't say my father, because my father's been dead 3 weeks, and you owe a dead man nothing the law would recognize. Why are you doing this?" It was a fair question and a hard one, and he didn't have a polished answer, so he gave her the unpolished one. "Because I was the half-frozen fool in the creek once," he said. "And a man I didn't know sat up 2 nights so I wouldn't die alone in the cold. And I've spent 12 years telling myself I'd have done the same for him and never once had to find out if it was true." He shrugged, and the shrug cost him something. "Here's the finding out. You walked up my track instead of him. I'm not going to fail the test just because the shape of it surprised me." Something in her face moved at that. Not tears. She'd clearly decided somewhere back down the road that tears were a luxury she'd ration, but something. She looked down at her hands. "I need to think," she said. "Take all the time you want. I'll have an answer by tomorrow. Take longer if you need it. Snow's coming either way. Neither of us is going anywhere." She took the day. She didn't waste it. Silas went out to his chores, half expecting her to keep to the cabin, and instead she came out an hour later in his spare coat with the sleeves rolled, having found it on the peg and made free with it, and she stood watching him muck the horse stalls for about a minute before she picked up the other fork and started in on the far end. He opened his mouth to tell her she didn't have to. He shut it again. He'd learned that much about people. That the ones who needed to feel useful didn't thank you for taking the chance away. She worked hard and smart and asked good questions. How many head did he run? What did the winter grays look like? Did he keep accounts, and where and when he allowed, as how his accounts were mostly in his head in a coffee tin? She went quiet in a way that he'd come to learn was Elena disapproving and being too polite to say so. At the noon meal she said, "You're losing money on the hay." He set down his fork. "Am I? You buy it from the Pruitt place down valley. I saw the receipts in the tin. You don't throw anything away, which is good. You just don't organize any of it, which is bad. You're paying town freight prices for hay. You've got the bottom land to grow yourself. You'd need a second cutting tool in a few days you don't think you can spare. And in 2 seasons you'd never pay another $1 for winter feed." She said it plain, not showing off, just laying down what she'd seen. "My father always said the difference between a man who survives out here and a man who gets ahead is whether he can do arithmetic when he's tired." Silas looked at her across the table, this small, stubborn, half-starved girl in his too big coat who'd been on his place not yet a full day and had already found the leak in his boat. "He say that to you a lot?" "All the time. Right up until he stopped being able to do arithmetic of any kind." A shadow crossed her, there and gone. "He'd be furious about the freight venture. The arithmetic on that was bad, and he did it anyway because he liked the man. He always trusted the wrong people and distrusted the right ones. It's the thing that killed him, really, not the lungs, the trusting." "Hard way to learn." "I learned it," she said. "I learned it well." And there was a warning in that, Silas understood, and not an unkind one. She was telling him she wasn't a fool and wouldn't be handled and didn't intend to trust him just because he'd been generous, and he found he respected that more than gratitude would have moved him. That night the snow came in earnest, the first true storm of the season, hissing against the window and stacking up white against the bottom of the door. The stove roared. Pike had given up all pretense and lay against Elena's feet, having decided sometime during the day that the new arrangement suited him. They sat across from each other in the orange light, and Elena said, "I have conditions." "Of course you do. You're not even going to ask what they are. You wouldn't be Whitlock's daughter if you didn't have conditions. Lay them out." She held up a finger. "I keep the books. All of them. You hand me that coffee tin, and you don't argue when I tell you we're not buying something. I won't spend us into a hole, but I won't be kept in the dark about our own money, and it's going to be our money if we do this. I've watched what happens to a woman who doesn't know where the money is. I won't be her. Done." A second finger. "I'm not a guest you tolerate. If I'm your wife on paper, I'm your partner in the work. You don't get to tell me a thing's not fit for a woman to do. My father raised me on a horse line. I can do more than you think, and I'll learn the rest." Done. Easier than the first one even. A third finger. She hesitated on this one. The color came up again. "And it stays what you said it is. A practical thing. I won't be... I came here desperate, and you know it. The whole world knows it. And a desperate woman can be made to feel she owes things. I won't feel that I owe you that. If it ever became something else, it would have to be because we both—" She stopped, and her jaw set. "It would have to be real, or it would have to be nothing. There's no in-between I'll live in." Silas was quiet a moment. The snow hissed. "That's the one condition I already made myself," he said. "So we're agreed on it twice over." She let out a breath. He realized she'd been holding it, holding herself braced against some answer she'd feared more than the cold. And it occurred to him then to wonder what she'd seen on the long road here, what doors she'd had to walk away from, what the men who gave her rides and wouldn't come up the track had said or hinted or reached for. It put a low, cold anger in him that surprised him with its size. He kept it off his face. It wasn't a thing she'd asked him to feel, and he didn't want to add to her load with it. "Then I suppose," Elena said slowly, "my answer is yes, with the conditions." "With the conditions," he agreed. And there it was. Done. Two people at a table in a snowstorm agreeing to a marriage neither of them had wanted that morning, for reasons that had more to do with a dead man and a cold creek 12 years gone than with anything either of them felt. It should have felt like less than it did. Silas couldn't have said why it felt like more. "We'll go to Cooper's Bend when the road clears," he said. "There's a preacher comes through, or the justice, if the preacher's not about. It'll be quick. Folks'll talk regardless. You ready for the talk? I've been talked about for 3 weeks by people who watched my father die and crossed the street rather than help. The talk doesn't scare me anymore." She picked up the coffee tin from the shelf where he'd set it and turned it over in her hands, this dented can full of his whole financial life. "What scares me is going through all this and still ending up with nothing. I've had nothing. I know exactly what it weighs. I'm not going back to it." "You won't," Silas said. He shouldn't have said it. He knew it even as it left him. You didn't make a promise like that in this country, not against winter and weather and the long list of things that could take a place down. But he'd heard the fear under her flatness, and he'd answered it before his good sense could stop him. And once it was out, he found he meant it harder than the careless words deserved. She looked at him a long moment, weighing it, weighing him. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Silas," she said quietly. "My father made promises he couldn't keep. It's why I had to walk 12 miles in the snow." He took the correction. It was a fair one. "All right," he said, "then I'll make you a promise I can keep. I'll work as hard as you every day. Whatever this place asks of us, I'll never ask more of you than I'm putting in myself. That one I can stand behind." She considered it. Then she nodded, once, the way her father might have, sealing something. "That one I'll take," she said. The storm blew 3 days. They were shut in together those 3 days, two near strangers in one room, and it should have been awkward, and in 100 small ways it was. The careful choreography of when to look away, the negotiation of a single wash basin. The first morning he woke to find she'd already remade the fire and set the coffee and was sitting in the good chair with the coffee tin's contents spread across the table, sorting 12 years of his receipts into stacks that meant something only to her. But somewhere in those 3 days, the awkwardness wore down into something else. It turned out they were both quiet people. And quiet people can share a room more easily than talkers, because they don't feel the need to fill every silence with proof that the silence is friendly. They worked. She sorted his accounts and asked her sharp questions, and he answered them, and twice he caught himself talking more than he'd talked to anybody in years, telling her about the land, about the high pasture, and the spring that didn't freeze, and the trouble he'd had 2 winters back when the wolves got bold. On the second night, she asked him about the river, about her father pulling him out. He told her. He hadn't told anybody, ever, the whole of it. The way the ice had given without sound, the cold so total it had felt almost like heat, the dark water, and the certainty, calm and complete, that he was going to die there alone and no one would ever know where. And then a hand, a stranger's hand in the dark, and a voice cursing him for a fool, and the long, impossible drag up the bank, and a fire that shouldn't have caught. "He cursed at you the whole time?" Elena asked. She'd drawn her knees up in the chair, listening. "Whole time. Called me every name there is and invented some new ones." Silas almost smiled at the memory. "I asked him later why he was so angry if he was saving me. He said anger was the only thing that'd keep his own hands working in that cold. Said if he let himself feel scared, we'd both die, so he chose mad instead." Elena went quiet. Then, That's him. That's exactly him. Her voice had gone thick. He was angry the whole time he was dying, too. Angry at the lungs, angry at the partner who robbed us, angry at himself. I used to think it was a hard way to go, but maybe it was the only thing keeping his hands working. Maybe it was, Silas said gently. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand, quick and embarrassed, and he looked at the fire to give her the privacy of it. After a while, she said, in a steadier voice, "Thank you for telling me that. I didn't have very many stories of him from before I was born. Now I have one." "You'll have more," Silas said. I'll dig them up. There's not many. We weren't social men, but what there is, they're yours." "More promises you can keep?" "That's the only kind I'm making from here out." That's a way. The road cleared on the fourth day, the sun coming up hard and bright on the new snow till the whole valley hurt to look at, and they hitched the wagon and drove the long way down to Cooper's Bend. It wasn't much of a town. A wide, muddy street, a mercantile, a livery, a church that doubled as the meeting hall, a saloon doing better business than the church. The snow had brought everybody out to dig, and the street was full, and Silas felt the looks land on the wagon as they came in. Him, who never came to town unless he had to, with a strange young woman beside him on the seat. He felt Elena go straight back beside him, felt her gather herself up to meet the looks. And he wanted to tell her she didn't have to, but he understood that she did, that this was the cost of the thing they'd decided and she'd rather pay it with her chin up. The preacher was through, as it happened, a tired circuit man named Beale, who married them in the church with the livery owner and his wife standing witness, because they were the nearest two warm bodies and didn't ask questions. It took less than 10 minutes. Beale said the words, and Silas said his part, and Elena said hers in a clear, steady voice, and there were no rings because neither of them had thought of it. So when Beale got to that part, Silas just took her hand instead and held it, and that seemed to do. Her hand was small and cold in his, and he was careful with it, the way you'd be careful with something you'd been entrusted to keep. And when he looked up, her gray eyes were on his face, unreadable, taking his measure one more time at the last possible moment, and he held still under it the way he had at the table and let her look. "You may," Beale started, and then stopped, having taken in something about the two of them that told him certain customary instructions might not apply, and he just closed his book instead and said, "Well, you're married. Congratulations to you both." And the liveryman clapped Silas on the shoulder and his wife pressed Elena's hand, and that was that. Outside the mercantile, while Silas loaded the supplies he'd come down for, a woman crossed the muddy street toward them. She was a handsome woman of about 50, dressed too well for Cooper's Bend, in a coat that had cost more than Silas's whole wardrobe, and she walked like she owned the ground she stepped on, which, Silas knew, she very nearly did. Margaret Holloway ran the biggest spread in 3 counties, the old Holloway range that her husband had built, and that she'd held and grown with a grip that had broken more than one neighbor who'd gotten between her and a piece of ground she wanted. She'd been after Silas's land for years. Not the whole of it, just the strip along the river where his spring fed down, the strip that would have let her run cattle through the dry months when everybody else's water failed. He'd told her no 4 times. She did not strike Silas as a woman who heard no very often or who liked it when she did. "Mr. Granger," she said. Her eyes went to Elena, and Silas watched them do the arithmetic. The wagon, the supplies, the strange young woman, the obvious recent business at the church. He watched Margaret Holloway add it all up and arrive at a number she did not care for. "I'd heard a rumor you'd taken a wife. I didn't believe it. You never struck me as the marrying kind." "Mrs. Holloway." Silas kept loading the wagon. "This is my wife, Elena. Charmed, I'm sure." Margaret's smile didn't go anywhere near her eyes. She looked Elena over the way you'd look over a horse you suspected of being lame. "And where did you come from, dear?" "Laramie, most recently," Elena said. Her voice was perfectly pleasant and perfectly cool, and Silas thought, she sees it too. She'd been on the place 4 days, and she could already read a thread across a muddy street. "My father knew Silas's family. It's a long story and not very interesting." "Oh, I'd wager it's interesting." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "A young woman of your evident quality, marrying a man 12 years her senior who lives 3 miles up a track and hasn't spoken 100 words in town in 8 years. There's always a story in a thing like that. There's usually money in the story, or the lack of it. She let that sit a moment, watching to see if it drew blood. But I'm being unkind. Forgive me. Married life is hard out here, Mrs. Granger, harder than a town girl knows. A great many things can go wrong on a small place with a thin margin. Weather, fire, debt. She said the words lightly, like pleasantries, like she was warning them about the cold. I do hope you'll both think very carefully about what you can really afford to hold on to. Sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is let go of a burden before it drags them down. We'll keep that in mind, Silas said. He'd stopped loading the wagon. He stood with one hand on the sideboard and met her eyes flat. Was there something you wanted, Mrs. Holloway, or did you just come over to wish us well? For a second, the pleasant mask slipped, and Silas saw the thing underneath it, the cold, patient calculation, the woman who'd buried 2 competitors and a husband and meant to bury this little obstacle too if it came to that. Only to wish you well, Margaret Holloway said. Congratulations again. Do give my regards to your spring. And she turned and walked back across the street the way she'd come, and Silas felt Elena let out a slow breath beside him. That woman wants something from you, Elena said quietly. My water. Has for years. And you've told her no. 4 times. Elena watched Margaret Holloway's expensive coat disappear into the mercantile. Something had gone hard and clear in her face, the same look she'd had over the coffee tin, the look of somebody seeing a problem whole and starting, already, to work it. She's going to be a problem, Elena said. It wasn't a question. Likely. Good, Elena said, and Silas turned to look at her, surprised. She caught his look and her mouth did the small thing that was almost a smile, the first one he'd seen since the church. I mean, it's good I know now. My father didn't know who was robbing him until it was too late. I'd rather see mine coming. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and arranged her skirts and looked down the muddy street toward the mercantile where the woman who wanted their land had just gone in out of the cold. Let her come. I've got nothing left to lose that I haven't already lost once. That makes a person hard to frighten. Silas looked up at her, this small, stubborn woman who'd walked 12 miles through the snow with a dead man's letter and married a stranger to keep from being eaten by the country, and who'd just looked the most dangerous person in 3 counties in the eye and decided she wasn't afraid. He finished loading the wagon. He climbed up beside her and took the reins and turned the team for home. And as they rolled out of Cooper's Bend with the whole town watching them go, he found himself thinking that whatever this strange arrangement was, whatever it was going to become, he was glad, plainly, simply glad in a way he hadn't been about anything in years. That when the trouble came, and it was coming, he wasn't going to be facing it alone. The wagon climbed up out of the valley toward the high ground where his land began, and neither of them said much, and the silence between them was the easy kind. And behind them in the town, a woman in an expensive coat stood at the mercantile window and watched them go, and began, in the cold, patient way she did everything to make her plans. The wagon ride home from Cooper's Bend took the better part of 2 hours, and by the time the cabin came into view through the bare cottonwoods, the afternoon light had gone thin and gold the way it did in November, making everything look briefly beautiful before the cold shut it down. Silas unhitched the team, and Elena carried the supplies in without being asked, and that was how the first day of their actual marriage ended, with 2 people putting away flour and salt pork in a 1-room cabin, not talking much, not needing to. What nobody tells you about a practical arrangement is that it still has to be lived. Day by day, hour by hour, all the ordinary friction of 2 people sharing a space and a life and a table. Silas had been alone long enough that he'd forgotten how much room his habits took up. He left his boots wherever they came off. He ate standing at the stove when he was hungry rather than at set meals. He had no system for anything, the tools, the feed sacks, the supplies, just the geography of a man who always knew where things were because nothing had ever moved without him moving it. Elena moved things, not all at once, and not without asking, mostly. But within the first 2 weeks, she'd reorganized the supply corner, built a proper system for the accounts that didn't involve a coffee tin, hung 2 hooks by the door for the boots he kept leaving in the middle of the floor, and convinced him, through what he could only describe as patient, relentless logic, to shift the hay storage so water couldn't pool against the bottom bales in the spring thaw. Each thing was reasonable. Each thing was an improvement. And each thing was also, in some small way, a rearrangement of the world he'd built alone, which was not comfortable even when it was correct. "You're scowling at the hooks," she said one morning, catching him looking. "I'm not scowling. Your face is doing a thing. My face does things. It's my face." She went back to the account book, but the corner of her mouth moved. He'd learned to watch for that. The almost smile, the thing that came and went quick like sun through clouds. She didn't laugh easily, and she didn't perform cheerfulness, and when something genuinely struck her as funny, she had no particular talent for hiding it, which meant when it happened, it felt real in a way he hadn't experienced often enough. He put his boots on the hooks. He didn't say anything about it. The work itself was the easier part. Elena had not been lying about her capacity for it. She was slight, but she didn't use that as an excuse, and she had the kind of physical intelligence that meant she figured out the efficient way to do a hard thing fast, without wasting effort. She was better with the horses than he'd expected. Better than he was in some ways, quicker to read their moods, less inclined to force when something wasn't working. She could cook in the frontier way, plain and adequate, and didn't make a production of it. She kept the cabin in a state of cleanliness that Silas had not previously understood was possible, which shamed him mildly every time he noticed it. But it was the books that showed what she actually was. She'd taken that coffee tin's worth of chaos and built it into something in 3 days. Every purchase, every sale, every debt and credit going back years, organized and cross-referenced in the tidy, precise hand of someone who'd been taught properly and then practiced until the teaching became instinct. She found things he hadn't known were there, an overpayment to the feed supplier 2 years back that she was fairly certain he could still claim, a pattern in the cattle prices that suggested he'd been selling 2 weeks too early every fall, a slow drain in the household accounts he hadn't noticed because it was too small to see in any single month, but added up to a significant loss over the years. "Who taught you this?" he asked one evening, watching her work. "My father kept me out of school half the time to help on the line," she said, not looking up. "But when I was in school, I was good at figures. The teacher said I had a head for it. My father said figures were the only thing that didn't lie if you did them right. He drilled me on the accounts every week from about the time I could hold a pencil." She paused, something tightening around her eyes. "And then he trusted a man who said the freight margins were good, and the man lied, and all that arithmetic didn't matter because he wanted to trust the wrong person. And you don't trust wrong people." "I try not to trust anybody until I have a reason." She looked up then, meeting his eyes directly. "I have reason to trust you. The conditions we made you've kept. I want you to know I noticed that." It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. It wasn't what anybody would call a warm declaration. But it was Elena. And Elena saying "I trust you" in her level voice meant more than a softer woman's more dramatic version would have, because he understood now that she measured those words out carefully and didn't spend them on things she didn't mean. "Mutual," he said, and went back to mending the harness. They got through November that way, sidewise, gradually, two people learning the shape of each other the way you learn a new place in the dark. Careful, attending, occasionally stubbing your toe. December came in hard, as it always did at elevation, and with the deep cold came the things the cold drove down from the mountains. 2 wolves working the lower pasture, a coyote bold enough to get into the chicken coop and cost them 3 hens before Silas trapped it, a section of the north fence that heaved out of the frozen ground and had to be restrung in temperatures that made the wire brittle and your fingers stop reporting back to your brain. Elena held the posts while he worked the wire and didn't complain about the cold, though he saw her tucking her hands under her arms between posts to keep them working. He started cutting the work shorter than he'd have cut it alone, coming in when he'd have once stayed out. And he told himself it was practical, that frozen fingers made mistakes, which was also true. The community came to them, slowly, the way things move in isolated places where news travels on hooves and rumors arrive before people do. 3 of the nearer homesteads sent wives to call in the first month, which Silas suspected was more about getting a look at the strange new wife than Christian courtesy. Elena received them at the table with coffee and what passed for small talk and managed them with a social ease that surprised him. She listened well, asked good questions, said almost nothing about herself, and sent each woman away feeling she'd been genuinely attended to, which Silas had come to understand was Elena's version of the fence and gate system. She let in what she chose and kept the rest out without ever making it obvious there was a gate at all. The Burkett family, Lars and his wife Maren, with 4 children ranging from toddler to nearly grown, were the closest neighbors, 4 miles down the valley, and they were the ones who became something that Silas would only loosely have called friends, mostly because Lars Burkett was too honest to be anything but genuine, and Maren had decided to like Elena on principle from the moment Elena spent a full morning helping her re-chink the cabin walls when Lars was laid up with a wrenched back, working cheerfully in the cold with a woman she'd met 3 weeks before. "Your wife fixed the Burkett East Wall," Lars told Silas in the road one afternoon, with a gravity that suggested this was serious news. "She's capable," Silas said. "Maren says she's the most sensible woman this side of the Bighorns." Lars paused. High praise from Maren. "Tell her we said thank you. She said to tell you the same." Lars glanced at him sidelong, the way a man will when he wants to say something he hasn't quite decided to say. There were some who said things. After you came back from Cooper's Bend with a wife. You know the kind of things. I know the kind. Most of it's settled down. People can see plain enough who she is." Lars looked back at the road. "Except there's one who keeps it going, keeps asking questions about where she came from, what she brought with her, whether there's any debt attached to the marriage. Asking it in town, asking it at the mill." Silas didn't need to ask who. "Holloway." Lars was quiet a moment. "You want to be careful there, Silas. She's got Critchfording surveying your eastern line again. 2 people saw him out there last week. That's public land she'd have him looking at. Public land adjacent to your spring water." Lars met his eyes. "I'm just saying what I saw and heard. I'm not a man who gets involved in other people's business." "I know you're not. I appreciate the telling." Lars nodded and drove on, and Silas stood in the road and felt the old familiar cold that had nothing to do with the weather settle in behind his ribs. He'd known she'd come at it again. He'd told Elena she would. He hadn't expected the surveyor, which meant it had moved faster than he'd thought, moved from implied pressure to something with a legal pretension to it, and that was a different thing. He told Elena that evening. He told her all of it, Lars's words and his own reading of them, watching her face while he talked. She listened the way she always listened, still and complete, and when he was done, she got up from the table and went to the wooden box where she kept the account books and the documents she'd organized, and she came back with a folded paper and laid it flat on the table between them. "Your land grant," she said. "Original. Filed in Cheyenne 1871. I pulled every record I could from the papers in the tin and the 2 you had in the desk." She put her finger on the eastern boundary line. "Here's your line. Here's the spring. Here's the land that feeds the spring on the upslope." She traced a small area above the mark. "This parcel. Who owns it?" Silas frowned. "Should be territorial. Hasn't been claimed. Has it been surveyed?" "Not that I know of." Elena pulled the paper back toward herself and studied it. She had that look, the one he associated now with a problem she was already 3 steps into solving. If she files a survey that places your spring water on land she subsequently claims, or casts your existing boundary as inaccurate, she can tie you up in territory court long enough that you can't finance the legal fight. Most small ranchers fold before it ever gets to a judge. The land or the cost of defending it breaks them first. She looked up. "That's the play." "I'd bet on it." Silas was quiet a moment. He'd known the shape of the threat, but he hadn't had it laid out quite so clean. It was uncomfortably clarifying. "You sound like you've seen this before." "My father had a neighbor in Missouri before I was born who lost his whole farm to a boundary dispute that got manufactured start to finish. He told me about it as a cautionary tale, said the man never saw it coming because he thought the law was straightforward." She folded the land grant back carefully along its original lines. "The law is a tool. The question is who has the better tools. And we don't have the money for lawyers." "Not yet. But we have something lawyers charge you for and you can do yourself if you know what you're looking for." She tapped the folded paper. "Records, original filings, survey maps. I need to get to the land office in Cheyenne and spend a week in the records room, and I need to know exactly where our lines sit before her man says where they sit." She said "are" without thinking about it, the possessive sliding naturally into the sentence, and neither of them remarked on it. "Cheyenne's 4 days each way in this weather," Silas said. "I know. I can't go. I can't leave the place with the cold like this, not with the livestock." "I wasn't asking you to go." She held his gaze. "I can make the trip. I've made worse." He didn't like it. He told himself it was practical concern, winter roads, a woman alone, and some of that was true. But there was another part of it that surprised him with its own presence, a thing that had nothing to do with practicality, that just didn't want her to be far away, and he didn't know what to do with that part, so he set it aside. The roads are bad. I'll go when they're better. January, maybe. After the worst of it. She pulled a fresh page from the account book and dated the top of it. In the meantime, I'm going to write down every question I need answered and every document I need to find. I'm not walking into that records room without knowing what I'm looking for. She paused, pen hovering. Do you trust me to do this? I said I did. You said you had reason to. There's a difference. The ghost of a smile. I'm asking if you'll let me run this, the legal side of it. I'll tell you everything I find and we'll decide together what to do with it, but I need to be the one who handles it. He looked at her across the lamplit table. His wife, who wasn't yet his wife in anything but name. This woman who'd walked 12 miles in the snow with nothing and in 2 months had organized his accounts and fixed his neighbor's walls and read a land swindle in a surveyor's footprints before the snow had even covered them. It's yours to run, he said. Something in her shoulders dropped slightly, a release of a tension she'd been carrying through the whole conversation, and he understood she'd been afraid he'd say no, not because she thought he'd stop her, but because she needed to know he believed she could. He made a note to say it more often. The winter ground on. Days got short enough that there was barely time to do what needed doing before the light failed, and they fell into rhythms so established they stopped being decided and just happened. He built the fire. She started the coffee. She kept the books while he checked the stock at last light. Sunday evenings, she read aloud from the 2 books she'd brought in the carpet bag, a volume of history and a technical manual on crop rotation that she treated with the same reverence other people gave scripture, and he listened without pretending he was doing anything else. They talked more than he'd talked in years, not about large things, not usually, about the work, the land, the neighbors, the plans she was making for the spring planting, but sometimes it went further. She told him about growing up behind her father's horse line, the smell of it, the particular way a horse's ear turns when it's thinking about throwing you. He told her about his first winter alone out here, the year he'd been so far into isolation that he'd genuinely lost track of what month it was and hadn't cared. She'd looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, somewhere between concern and something softer, and said, "Does it bother you? Having someone here now? Honestly." Honestly? He'd had to think about it. No, it bothers me in small ways, the boots, the moving of things, but no, the part that should bother me doesn't. Why not? He didn't have an answer that wasn't embarrassing, so he said, maybe I was lonelier than I thought. She'd gone quiet after that in the way that meant she was filing the thing somewhere careful. Margaret Holloway made her next move in January, and she made it publicly. The winter community gathering at Cooper's Bend was a loose tradition, held at the church hall when the snow kept everyone off the range and people needed to see faces that weren't in their own cabin. Silas generally avoided it. Elena said they should go, and her reasoning was sound. Visible people were harder to make claims against than invisible ones, and the community's read on their marriage was still forming and worth influencing. So they went, 2 days after a thaw broke the roads. The hall was full and hot with bodies and the smell of wet wool. Silas kept to the edge of it the way he always did in crowds. Elena moved into the middle with the quiet, purposeful social ease she had, finding Marin Burkett and 2 of the other Homestead women and sitting with them, drawing them into the kind of particular female conversation that men were not party to and that Silas suspected accomplished more than any number of public meetings. He watched her across the hall and noticed the way the women leaned toward her, the way Marin laughed at something she said. In 2 months, she'd become a person this community had a relationship with, and he'd barely noticed it happening. Margaret Holloway arrived late, as she always did, so people had time to notice her arrival. She had 2 men with her, her foreman and a soft-handed man Silas didn't recognize, in a coat too thin for the country and boots too clean for a working man, a lawyer or a clerk, Silas guessed, someone whose work was done on paper. She worked the room with the particular skill of someone who'd been managing people's impressions for decades. She was warm with the right people, reserved with the ones she'd decided didn't matter, and she had a way of making each person feel briefly central to her attention that cost her nothing and bought her more than it should have. Silas watched it with a kind of professional respect, the way you watch someone do something well, even when you despise the doing of it. When she reached him, she extended her hand and smiled the smile that reached 6 inches short of her eyes. "Mr. Granger, so good of you to come out. And your wife?" She scanned the room with an ease that said she'd already located Elena and filed the information. "Ah, getting on well with the Burkett woman. I see. That's good. It must be hard coming into an established community from outside. So many things a newcomer doesn't know. About the land, the people, the history of things." She turned back to him, and her eyes had the cold patience in them again. "I've been speaking with my surveyor. He's found some things about your eastern boundary that are concerning. I'd hate for you and your wife to be blindsided by a legal matter. It's always better when neighbors can come to an understanding between themselves." "My line is where it was filed," Silas said. 1871. "Paper is such a funny thing," Margaret said pleasantly. "It says what it says, but the ground doesn't always match. Survey equipment has gotten so much more precise in recent years. What seemed settled sometimes opens up." She let that sit. "I'm simply saying that if you found yourself in a difficult position, financially, legally, there are people who would pay a fair price for a parcel you could spare without too much hardship. The spring water parcel, specifically, just that small piece. You'd barely miss it." "I'd miss my water," Silas said. "Other arrangements can be made for water. My wife might have a different view of that." Something moved in Margaret's face, a small cold recognition, the first time she'd acknowledged Elena as a variable rather than scenery. "Yes, she's quite engaged, isn't she? For someone so new to the territory." Her voice was still pleasant. The pleasantness was the threat. A young woman with no land of her own and no family and some amount of debt behind her can find herself in a very exposed position if things on the ranch don't go well. I'd want any wife of mine to understand the landscape. The real landscape, not the paper one. He looked at her a long, steady moment. He said, "I'll tell her you were asking after her." Margaret smiled. "Please do." She moved away into the crowd, the soft-handed lawyer man trailing, and Silas turned back to the room and found Elena looking at him from across it. She'd seen. She couldn't have heard, but she'd watched his face through the conversation, and whatever his face had done had told her what she needed to know, because her chin lifted a fraction and her jaw set, and she held his gaze for a moment with an expression that was not fear. On the drive home, the horses picking through the dark, careful on the packed snow road, Elena said, "The man with her, the one in the city coat. I saw him." "Do you know who he is?" "No. Lawyer, I'd guess. Or a land agent." She pulled her coat tighter. "Either way, she is moved from suggesting to filing. Something's already been put on paper somewhere." She was quiet a moment, working it. "I need to go to Cheyenne." "Road's open now." "I know, next week." She paused. "What did she say to you?" He told her. All of it. Exact, because she'd asked for that when they'd laid out the conditions. No managing, no softening. She listened without interrupting, and when he was done she was quiet a long time, long enough that the dark and the cold and the horse-breath steam started to fill up the space where her voice should have been. "She mentioned my debt," Elena said finally. Not a question. "She did. She did her research." "Seems like." Elena's hands were flat on her knees, pressing down, and he could see her jaw working slightly, the only thing that gave away the feeling running under the flat surface of her voice. "My father's debt is mine. I know that. I've never tried to hide it from you or anybody, but she's trying to use it. She's trying to make it into a story where I'm a liability you took on and now you'll be dragged down with me." She turned to look at him. Her eyes in the dark were hard and clear. "Is that how you see it?" Silas thought about the careful, honest answer. "No," he said. "I see a woman who in 2 months turned my accounts from a coffee tin disaster into something a real business would be proud of, found a probable survey fraud before it happened, and convinced Marin Burkett to like her, which I've been trying to do for 3 years. Kept his eyes on the road. "I made a practical arrangement. So did you. But I wasn't wrong about you, and she's not going to find leverage in you being here. She's going to find the opposite." Elena was quiet another moment. Then she turned back to the road, and the tension in her jaw eased, not gone, but set differently, the way a person sets their weight when they're getting ready to push. "All right," she said, "then let's not give her time to file what she's got. I leave Monday." She left Monday. He put her on the southbound coach himself, loaded down with the land documents she'd organized and a list of questions so precise it might have been written by an attorney, and he watched the coach until it was gone around the bend in the road and then went home to a cabin that was, suddenly and without warning, too quiet in a way it hadn't felt before she'd ever come. He fed the stock and fixed the fence that had come loose again in the wind and ate standing at the stove the way he used to. And in the evening he sat in the good chair, her chair, he thought of it already, and felt the specific particular weight of an absence that he hadn't known he'd been feeling until it was there to feel. Pike put his head on Silas's knee and looked up at him with the ancient dog wisdom that had no words and didn't need any. "I know," Silas said. She was gone 10 days. She came back on a Thursday with ink stains on her fingers and a look on her face that he'd come to recognize. The look of someone who'd found what they were looking for and was holding it carefully, the way you hold something fragile on a long road. She sat down at the table and didn't even take her coat off first, just laid out the papers she'd brought back, copies neatly made of records from the land office, and pointed to 3 different items, walking him through each one while her coffee went cold. "Here," she said. "This is Holloway's original filing from '68. This is the survey she submitted with it. Now look here." Her finger moved to a second document. "This is the territorial survey from '67, the one her filing references. They don't match. The reference points are off. Not by much, but enough that if you draw the legal boundary from the original survey, her land stops here." She put her finger down precise and certain. "Not here, where she's been claiming. And here," a third document. "There's a homestead filing from 1873. Abandoned, but it was filed, and it was filed on the upslope parcel above your spring, which means nobody else can claim it without clearing the abandonment through the territory court first, including her, including anyone she hires to claim it for her." Silas looked at the papers. He looked at her face. "You're sure?" "I'm sure of what the documents say. A lawyer would need to confirm it holds in court, but I've read everything twice, and I had the clerk at the land office check my reading on the survey discrepancy. He wouldn't put it in writing, but he didn't tell me I was wrong either." She finally reached up and started unbuttoning her coat, the task completed, her hands free for other things. "She's been claiming land that isn't hers and calling it established fact for 20 years, and nobody ever looked it up. Because why would they? She's Margaret Holloway. Her word is the landscape." Elena's voice had stayed level all the way through, but there was something under it, something tight and bright. Until somebody looked it up, Silas sat back. He was aware of something loosening in him that had been clenched since January, since the gathering in the cold hall, since Margaret Holloway had said exposed position in her pleasant voice. "We need a lawyer," he said. "We need a lawyer. I know one in Cheyenne, or I found one, who handles territorial land cases and charges less than the others because he's new and still proving himself, which is exactly what we want, someone with something to prove." She pulled the coffee toward her, realized it was cold, pushed it back. "He'll need a retainer. I've looked at the accounts. We can do it if we hold off on replacing the broken harness fittings until March." "The harness fittings can wait. I thought you'd say that." She looked at him across the papers. Her eyes were tired from 10 days of records rooms and bad sleep in the Cheyenne boarding house, but there was something alive in them that tired couldn't dim. "She doesn't know yet what I found. She's still planning her move. That gives us time." "Time to do what?" "To make our move first." She put her hands flat on the documents. "We file a boundary confirmation with the territory before she files her survey. We cite the '67 discrepancy. We put it on record that we know, which makes it a great deal harder for her to pretend the problem doesn't exist. She wanted to catch us unprepared and run us through a legal fight we couldn't afford, with facts we didn't have." Elena lifted her eyes to his. "She didn't count on us having the facts." Silas looked at this woman across his table, her table, their table, who'd come to him with a dead man's letter and nothing else, and in 4 months had learned the land, built the books, walked into a strange city alone, spent 10 days in records rooms that smelled like old paper and bureaucrats, and come home with the exact 3 documents that might save everything they had. He thought about the creek 12 years ago, the hand in the dark, the fire that shouldn't have caught. He thought about how some debts you pay forward and some you pay sideways, and the lucky thing is when the payment turns out to be worth making on its own terms, quite apart from what you owed. "Send the letter to the lawyer," he said. "Today, if the road rider's still running." Elena nodded. She turned back to the papers and reached for her pen, and outside the February wind moved through the bare cottonwoods with a sound like distant water, and the stove ticked, and Pike came and lay down under the table the way he always did now, half under her feet and half under Silas's, settling into the warm place between them like he'd always known it was his. The lawyer's name was Aldous Crane, and he wrote back in 10 days with a letter that was either encouraging or cautious, depending on which paragraph you were reading. Elena read it 4 times and summarized it for Silas at the supper table. The survey discrepancy was real and documentable. The abandoned homestead filing was a genuine complication for any claim Holloway tried to make on the upslope parcel, and the boundary confirmation filing Elena had proposed was not only possible, but advisable. The problem was timing. Territory Court ran on its own calendar, and getting a boundary confirmation on the docket before Holloway's surveyor filed his own competing claim would require moving faster than the court usually liked to move. Crane said he could push it. He also said pushing it would cost more than the standard retainer. Elena put the letter down and looked at the accounts she'd built and the numbers she knew cold by now. And she told Silas they could cover it if the spring calves came in healthy and they got a decent price at the fall market. 2 conditions that the country might or might not cooperate with. Do it, Silas said. If the calves don't come in, do it anyway. We don't win the small fight by losing the big one. She sent Crane his money and his instructions, and they waited, and while they waited, the work of the ranch didn't pause for any of it. March came in rough and went out rougher, and by the time April broke the frost out of the ground, they were both running on less sleep than was good for either of them. The calves came, 12 of them, and 9 were healthy and strong and 3 were not, which was not the worst outcome and not the best, which was generally what the country offered. What grew between them in those months was not what either of them would have called romance, not then. It was something with less of a name but more substance, the particular trust that builds between people who've been in bad weather together and kept their word. Silas knew by now that when Elena went quiet at the table, something was bothering her, and she was working it alone first, and that the correct response was to leave her alone and put coffee within reach. Elena knew that when Silas got short in his answers, he wasn't angry at her, but at the thing he couldn't fix, and that the correct response was to hand him a task that had a clear solution, because his hands needed to be solving something when his mind couldn't. They knew each other's sleep sounds. They knew the way the other one moved through the cabin in the dark without needing light. These were small things, intimate in the way that only daily life produces, and neither of them said anything about them, because what was there to say? Once, in late April, she'd been on the roof patching a section of boards he hadn't gotten to in the fall, and he'd come around the corner of the cabin and seen her up there and felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, just the sudden animal awareness of something that could break and the desire to prevent it. And he'd said her name sharper than he'd meant to, and she'd looked down at him with her hand shielding her eyes from the sun and said, "I'm fine, Silas." And he'd said, "I know you are," and gone back around the corner and stood there a moment with one hand on the cabin wall. He didn't examine it. He was not, constitutionally, a man who examined things. He just filed it and went back to work. The letter from Crane came in early May with better news than expected. The boundary confirmation had been filed and accepted, and the territory clerk had attached a notation citing the 1867 survey discrepancy that meant any competing claim on the upslope parcel would have to answer it directly. It wasn't a final judgment, it wasn't a guarantee, but it was a stake in the ground, official and on record, and it was theirs. Elena read the letter at the table and let out a breath that had been held, Silas suspected, since February. Then she folded it precisely and put it in the document box and stood up and went outside, and he watched her go without following. He gave her a few minutes. When he came out, she was at the fence rail looking out over the north pasture, which was green now for the first time since she'd arrived, the grass coming up through last year's brown the way it always did out here. Slow, then suddenly, like it had been waiting for permission. "We bought ourselves time," she said, when she heard him come up beside her. "That's what the money was for." "She's not going to stop." "No," he agreed. "But she can't pretend the documents don't exist now. Whatever she does next has to go through the territory record, and the record says our line is where we say it is." He put his elbows on the fence rail beside hers. "That changes the cost of coming at us. Makes it harder and more public." Elena nodded slowly. She had a piece of fence grass in her fingers, turning it. My father always said the best fights are the ones where the other person decides it's too expensive before they throw the first punch. She paused. I don't think she's made that decision yet. Neither do I. So we keep watching. We keep watching, he said. They were watching in June when Critch Fording, Holloway's man, the one who'd been spotted near the Eastern Line in January, started showing up at Cooper's Bend with a new traveling companion, a wide, flat-faced man named Del Pruitt, who everybody in the valley knew by reputation and nobody knew by choice. Pruitt did occasional work for Holloway, the kind of work that didn't get talked about afterward, and his presence anywhere near a situation was the kind of sign that a smart person read and took seriously. Lars Burkett mentioned seeing them at the saloon twice in 1 week, and Lars was not a man who mentioned things without reason. Silas said nothing to Elena about Pruitt specifically, which was a mistake he'd later think about, the one time he tried to manage information he'd promised not to manage. He told himself it was unconfirmed and not worth troubling her with, which was partly true and partly the old instinct of a solitary man who'd learned to carry things alone. The instinct was wrong, and he knew it even while he was doing it. What he did do was start sleeping lighter, and he started checking the barn before he turned in, which he hadn't done in years. The fire started on a Thursday night in the second week of July, and he smelled it before he heard it, the specific wrong smell of hot wood and hay that doesn't belong in the nighttime air, and he was off the floor and out the door before he was fully awake. Elena 2 steps behind him because she slept light too, and the smell had reached the loft. The hay barn was going. Not fully. Not yet. One corner, the northeast end where the oldest hay sat, already stacked dry for the summer, and the fire had a hold on it that was maybe 20 minutes old by the look of it, climbing the interior wall with the specific patient appetite of fire and dry hay, which is one of the hungriest things there is. 20 minutes more and it would have the whole structure. What followed was not heroic in the way stories make firefighting sound. It was chaos and heat, and the horses screaming in the adjacent corral, and Elena running for the water pump while Silas ran for the horses because the horses would kill themselves on the fence if they weren't gotten out first, and dead horses were a worse loss than burned hay. He got 3 out before the smoke got bad enough that the 4th one wouldn't come, wouldn't move, just screamed and rolled its eyes back, and he had to go in twice more, and the second time came out coughing hard enough that he couldn't straighten up for a minute, and Elena was there, her hand on his back, pushing him away from the door. "The pump won't do it," she said, her voice tight and flat and working. "We need the creek line." "Get the Burketts. I already sent Pike." She'd tied a rag around her face against the smoke. Her eyes above it were watering but clear and focused. "The bucket line from the creek, Silas. Tell me where the extra buckets are." "Tack room south wall." She went. He went back for the 4th horse, and this time got a blanket over its eyes and got it moving, got it out. And by the time he had the animal to the fence line, Elena was already coming back with 3 buckets and the grim, purposeful stride of someone who'd already decided how this ended. They ran water from the creek to the barn for an hour before the Burketts arrived, Lars and his 2 older boys. And then it was enough hands to set a real line, and the fire came down slow and resentful and finally went out in the northeast corner with maybe a third of the barn left standing on that end, and the rest of it smoke black but intact. The hay in the burned section was gone, most of the winter stores on that side. Not all of it. Not enough to kill them, but enough. Silas stood in the ruined corner in the gray pre-dawn, with the smell of wet, burned wood soaking into everything, and looked at what was left and did the math. It was ugly math. They'd be short on winter feed. Not critically. Elena's reorganization of the supply costs meant they had more margin than he'd had in previous years, but short enough that they'd need to buy, and buying at winter prices would hurt. Lars stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. The boys were watering down the edges of the burn site in case of rekindling. "How'd it start?" Lars said finally. "I don't know yet." Lars looked at the northeast corner, at the origination point of the burn, the place where the char was deepest and blackest. He was quiet another moment. That corner was away from the lamp, away from the house, away from anything that'd throw a spark natural. "I know. There were tracks," Elena said. She'd come up behind them without either of them hearing, and her voice made Lars startle slightly. She'd washed her face at some point, but her clothes were still smoke dark, and she had a burn on the back of her left hand she hadn't mentioned. "Coming in from the east side behind the barn, I saw them when I was running the creek line. Boot prints, 2 sets, and the grass is pressed down in a line going back toward the eastern fence. Lars looked at her, then at Silas. 2 sets. 2 sets, Elena said. Silas turned and looked at the eastern fence line, at the darkness beyond it where his land met the public ground that met, eventually, Holloway's range. The sun was just starting to color the edge of the sky, and the shadows were long and the land gave nothing away. Marin Burkett fed them breakfast in their own kitchen while Lars and the boys finished the assessment, and Elena sat at the table with her burned hand wrapped in a cloth, and ate, because not eating when your body had been through what hers had been through in the last 3 hours was stupid, not noble, and she was not stupid. But she didn't eat much. She was somewhere else in her head, and Silas recognized the look by now. The look of Elena working a problem, laying out pieces, finding the shape. On the ride back to the barn, she said, "I want to look at those tracks before the day traffic ruins them." I was going to. I want to look at them myself, not because I think you'll miss something, but because 2 sets of eyes see different things, and I want my set on it. She glanced at him sideways. "And I want you to tell me what you know about Del Pruitt." He looked at her. "Who told you about Pruitt?" "Marin, this morning while you were outside, she mentioned Lars had seen Pruitt and Fording together in town." Elena kept her eyes forward. "You knew." He didn't try to deny it. "Lars told me, a few weeks back. I thought it was unconfirmed." "Silas." She said his name the way a person says it when they want you to understand they're not yelling even though they have something to yell about. "We agreed. No managing information." "You're right. I'm sorry." She accepted it without drama. "Tell me what you know about him." So he told her what there was to know about Del Pruitt, which wasn't much but was all of a type. A man who'd been accused of 2 things he'd never been charged with, both of them involving property damage that benefited whoever was paying him at the time. Both times it had been alleged, and both times nothing had stuck because the evidence was thin and the man was careful. "Careful men leave tracks anyway," Elena said. "They just think they don't." They spent an hour at the tracks behind the barn before the morning wind shifted and started breaking them apart. Elena crouched down and looked at them the way she looked at account books. Patient, systematic, moving from the clearest impression to the fainter ones in a deliberate order. She found 4 things. The size difference between the 2 sets of boots, one large and one medium. A distinctive wear pattern on the larger right boot, the heel worn down on the outside edge, in a way that left an uneven mark. A piece of rough wool caught on the lowest wire of the eastern fence, gray-brown, nothing distinctive on its own. And 20 feet out into the grass beyond the fence, a small glass bottle, empty, that had been dropped or fallen from a pocket, no label, with a residue inside that smelled like what it was. Elena held the bottle up and looked through it at the morning sky. "Accelerant," she said quietly. "They used something to start it fast in the dry hay. This was the container." Silas took it and smelled it. He recognized it. The particular sharp chemical edge of refined coal oil, the kind that came in cans at the mercantile or could be obtained from any of the operations that used it for lamps in quantity. "Holloway's operation uses it for the bunkhouse lamps," he said. "Most big operations do." "Most does, but this bottle—" Elena turned it over. There was a mark on the bottom, a rough stamp, a number or letter worn half off. "This came from somewhere specific, a supplier who marks his stock." She put it in her apron pocket. "I want to know who sells marked bottles in this county." "Elena." He said her name the way she'd said his. "Careful." "I know," she said. "I know it's not proof. I know one bottle proves nothing, and 2 sets of tracks prove nothing. And Del Pruitt, in a saloon, proves nothing." She looked up at him from where she was crouched by the fence. Her face was tired and smoke-smudged and absolutely certain. "But nothing plus nothing plus nothing is eventually something. My father didn't count the nothings until there were too many of them, and by then they added up to everything he had. I'm counting from the start." He looked down at her, this woman in the grass by his fence at 6 in the morning, holding a bottle that might matter and might not. And he understood that what he was looking at was the thing he'd hoped for and feared in equal measure, the thing that made her invaluable and put her in danger in the same breath. She was not going to let this go. She was going to pull every thread and follow every lead and document every small nothing until she had the something. And Margaret Holloway, if she was watching, which she was, would know it too. Get up, he said. Your hand needs looking at. She stood. She let him look at the burn on the back of her hand, which was more serious than the cloth wrapping suggested, a long red mark that was blistering at the edge. He was more careful with it than was strictly necessary. It's fine, she said. It's not fine. It's just not bad. He kept his eyes on her hand. You need to be more careful. I was running a bucket line in the dark. I know what you were doing. She was quiet a moment. Silas, look at me. He looked up. I'm all right, she said, specific and direct the way she always was, making sure he'd actually heard. I'm all right, and we're going to handle this. He let go of her hand. He nodded, once. They spent the next 2 weeks doing the work the fire had forced on them, shoring up the burned corner, salvaging what hay could be salvaged, rebuilding the hay supply through a combination of late purchase and a trade arrangement Elena negotiated with the Burketts that was better for both sides than either would have gotten from a merchant. All of this while Elena was also building something else quietly on the side, a document that was not an account book. She'd gotten a notebook from the Cooper's Bend Mercantile, and she was keeping it the way she kept the accounts, systematic, dated, nothing without a source. The boot track measurements with a sketch, the wool fiber, wrapped in paper and described. The bottle and its bottom stamp, described in detail, and cross-referenced against every supplier Elena could identify who marked their stock. She'd sent 2 letters to Cheyenne, one to Crane with the details of the fire, asking his opinion on its legal significance, and one to the territorial office with a question about Del Pruitt's record that she phrased carefully enough that it looked like a general inquiry about property crime history in the county. Crane wrote back to say the fire might constitute criminal arson and might constitute civil damages, but only if they had evidence of who and evidence of connection to Holloway, and that right now they had neither, just suspicion and a bottle and some grass-pressed tracks that any defense lawyer would dismantle in 10 minutes. He wasn't discouraging them. He was being honest, which Elena had told him from the start was the only kind of legal advice she wanted. The territorial office letter came back with a page of case records that confirmed 2 prior accusations against Del Pruitt and 1 acquittal in a third matter involving a disputed fence fire in Converse County 4 years back. Elena read this 3 times and then wrote the county name in her notebook and underlined it twice. Converse County, she said at the supper table. Silas put down his fork. That's where Holloway's sister had her place, before she sold. Elena looked up from the notebook, a moment of perfect stillness between them. You're sure, she said. Sure enough, the sister was a Colebrook before she married, sold the Converse County land about, he thought back, about 4 years ago, maybe 5. Elena wrote Colebrook in her notebook. She drew a line from it to Pruitt's name. She drew another line to Holloway's. She sat back and looked at the shape of what she'd drawn. It's circumstantial, she said. All of it. It's more than nothing. It's a lot of nothings that are starting to look like a shape. She turned the notebook so he could see the page. It looked like a web or a map, all the pieces connected by her careful lines. If I can find anyone in Converse County who dealt with that fence fire, a witness, someone who was questioned and remembers something, someone who saw Pruitt in the area at the time. She paused. I can't go to Converse County, Silas, not with the ranch still mending, but I can write. Write then. I need names, people to write to. You know this territory better than I do. Does anyone from around here have connections in Converse County? He thought about it. He thought about 4 years of sparse social contact and the thin web of acquaintance it had produced. Reverend Beale, he said after a while, the circuit preacher who married us. He works counties, including Converse, knows people everywhere. A preacher would know who'd been in a legal dispute. People talk to preachers. People tell preachers things they don't tell anyone else. Elena nodded slowly. She turned the notebook back and wrote Beale's name. Can you find him? He comes through Cooper's Bend every 6 weeks or so. Should be due again soon. Then we wait for Beale. She closed the notebook and tucked it away in the document box where she kept everything that mattered. In the meantime, I want to find out who sells those marked bottles. I've written to 4 suppliers in Cheyenne, 2 in Laramie. That could take weeks. Then it takes weeks. She picked up her fork again, resumed eating like the conversation had come to a natural stopping point. We're not in a hurry to be wrong. We're in a hurry to be right. Beale turned up on a Tuesday in late July. his old roan mare looking like she'd had better decades. The man himself, thin as a fence rail and full of the particular energy of someone who'd been moving constantly long enough that stillness had stopped being a natural state. Silas caught him coming through Cooper's Bend and brought him out to the ranch for supper, and Elena fed him properly and let him talk for a while, because people who talked for a while eventually came around to the thing you needed, if you were patient. Over coffee, Elena said, "Reverend, did you work the Converse County Circuit 4 years back?" "I did. Still do, some. Ugly country out that way. Good people, though, mostly." "Do you remember a fence fire involving a man named Pruitt?" Beale set his cup down. Something moved in his eyes, a recognition, and then something more careful. A man weighing what he knew against what he should say about it. "I remember a fence fire in Converse County," he said. "I remember it because I'd just come through that area 2 weeks before, and a family called Marsh had their fence intact and their hay stacked fine. And I came through after, and it was ash, and they'd lost their winter feed, same as you, and—" He stopped. "I remember the family said they'd seen a man on their east line, but they couldn't say who. They told the sheriff. He didn't find much." "Would the Marsh family remember what they saw?" Beale looked at her, then at Silas, then back. "Mrs. Granger, what are you asking me exactly?" "I'm asking if there's someone who can speak to a pattern. We have evidence of arson on our property. We have evidence connecting the likely person to a prior incident. We need a witness who can say that person was in the area of that prior incident, because a pattern is what moves a sheriff from skeptical to serious." She said it plainly. No theater in it, just the facts as she saw them. "We're not asking anyone to lie. We're asking whether the truth exists and whether someone who has it will tell it." Beale was quiet a long moment. He was a man who'd spent his working life navigating the difference between what people ought to do and what they'd actually do, and Elena could see him running that calculation. Finally, he said, "The Marsh boy, the oldest one, man now, he'd be about 20. He was the one who saw the figure by the east fence. He came to me after, private, because the sheriff made him feel foolish for reporting it. He had more detail than he'd given the sheriff. He was afraid of trouble. Is he still in Converse County? Far as I know. Would he talk to me if I wrote to him? Through you, as an introduction?" Beale looked at his hands. "He might. He's had 4 years to be angry about what happened to his family's winter stores." He looked up. "And it didn't fix itself. What happened to them?" "The Marsh operation's been thin ever since." Elena reached into her apron pocket and put the small marked bottle on the table between them. "Does this mark mean anything to you? Have you seen it on supply bottles in Converse County?" Beale picked it up and turned it. His eyebrows rose slightly. "There's a supply operation out of Douglas that marks their commercial lamp oil stock. A family operation, Hendricks. They put a stamp on the commercial grade to distinguish it from what they sell retail." He set the bottle down. "I've been in their storehouse. This is their mark." Elena sat very still. "Holloway's operation, does she purchase through Douglas suppliers?" "She'd have to, for her eastern range. That's the closest supply point for that side of her property." Beale looked between them again, and whatever he was reading in their faces resolved something for him, some internal question he'd been working. "I'll write to young Marsh tonight if you've got paper and a lamp." "I've got both," Elena said. Silas watched her get up and go to the desk for the paper, and he watched Beale watching her too, with an expression that was partly admiration and partly something that looked almost like relief. The expression of a man who'd been waiting for someone to pay attention to a wrong and had started to think nobody would. The letter went out with Beale the following morning. Elena had written her own letter to Crane with everything they now had: Pruitt's record, the Converse County incident, Beale's testimony about the Douglas supplier, the bottle, the boot tracks, the wool fiber, and asked him whether the totality of it was enough to take to the Cooper's Bend sheriff. Crane's response came 8 days later, and for the first time since February, it contained something that was not a caution or a qualification. It said, "Yes, take it to the sheriff, take everything you have and present it in order. If the sheriff won't act, I can make a case to the territorial marshal. One way or another, this goes in front of someone with authority to compel testimony. What you've assembled is not proof, but it is a pattern, and a pattern is where every proven case begins. You have done good work, Mrs. Granger, thorough and careful. Present it exactly as you've documented it and let the facts make their own argument." Elena read this standing at the table, still in her work clothes from the morning chores, and she read it twice, and then she set it down very carefully on the table like something that might break. "Well?" Silas said. "We go to the sheriff," she said. He'd been watching her face through the reading, the way it had stayed still and careful through the cautious parts, and the way something in it had shifted on Crane's last lines. Not dramatically, not the way a person looks in a story when things go their way. Just a small private release, the kind that only happens when you've been holding something up for a very long time and you finally get to put it down. "When?" he said. "Thursday," she said. "I want one more day on the documentation. I want it organized so well that the sheriff can follow it even if he'd rather not." She picked up the notebook. "And Silas, I need you to know that whatever the sheriff does or doesn't do, this isn't over with Holloway. Getting the law involved is just the next thing. It's not the last thing. I know that. I need you not to expect it to be simple from here. I've never once in my life expected anything to be simple," he said. "I'm not starting now." She looked at him. She nodded. Then she sat down and opened the notebook and started working, and the lamp burned on the table between them. While outside the summer dark settled over the ranch and the burned corner of the hay barn stood quiet against the sky. Evidence of a thing that had been meant to break them and had not, and would not. Because the woman at the table with the notebook and the pen was not a person who let things break her without first understanding exactly how the breaking had been done and exactly who had done it. Sheriff Dale Coombs had held the Cooper's Bend post for 11 years, which was long enough to know which fights were worth picking and which ones would pick you back twice as hard. He was a careful man, not a coward, but careful in the specific way of someone who understood that Margaret Holloway had been in this county longer than he had and would likely be here after him, and that her goodwill was worth something concrete while a small rancher's complaint was worth considerably less. When Silas Granger had come to him twice before about the boundary survey business, Coombs had listened politely and done approximately nothing. And he'd felt all right about that because feeling all right about nothing was a skill he'd developed over 11 years. So when Silas and Elena came through his office door on a Thursday morning in early August, Coombs had his polite listening face ready and his filing cabinet mentally open for the complaint he expected to put away and forget. What he had not prepared for was Elena's notebook. She laid it on his desk and opened it to the first page and walked him through it the way Crane had suggested. In order, one piece at a time, each item sourced and dated and cross-referenced to the next. She didn't editorialize. She didn't accuse. She presented the documentation the way a ledger presents numbers, and let the numbers speak. The boot track measurements and the sketch. The wool fiber. The marked bottle and Beal's identification of the Douglas supplier, and the supplier's connection to Holloway's Eastern Range purchasing. Pruitt's prior record in the territory, the Converse County incident and its structural similarity to the July fire. And finally, the letter from young Cal Marsh that had arrived 4 days after Beal's introduction had gone out. A careful, angry letter from a 20-year-old in Converse County who had waited 4 years to tell someone official what he'd seen near his family's fence line, and who described in specific detail a large man with a distinctive outside-worn right boot heel who'd been seen crossing the Marsh eastern fence 2 days before their hay burned. Coombs read the Marsh letter twice. He looked up at Elena. He looked at Silas. He looked back at the notebook. "This is all circumstantial," he said. "Yes," Elena said. "It's also consistent, documented, cross-county, and involves a man you know has been accused of this before and never properly investigated." She kept her voice even. Not challenging, just clear. "We're not asking you to arrest anyone today, Sheriff. We're asking you to compel testimony, specifically from the Hendricks supply operation in Douglas, about who purchased marked commercial lamp oil in the 6 weeks before our fire, and from Del Pruitt, about his whereabouts on the night of July 10th. She paused. "If the testimony doesn't support the pattern, then it doesn't. We'll live with that. But the testimony needs to be compelled because men like Pruitt don't volunteer what they know." Coombs sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the gesture of a man doing difficult arithmetic. Then he looked back at Elena, and something in his careful face had shifted slightly. "You put this together yourself." "With my husband's help." "Your husband's help," Coombs repeated, in a tone that suggested he and Silas both knew how much of the help had been directional. He drummed his fingers once on the desk. "I'll write to the Douglas sheriff today, and I'll have a conversation with Pruitt." He said it like a man agreeing to something he hadn't fully decided yet, the words outpacing the commitment, but the words were there and Elena took them. "Thank you," she said. She closed the notebook. She did not take it with her. She pushed it across the desk toward him. "Keep that. It's a copy. I have the original." Coombs looked at the notebook sitting on his desk. He looked like a man who'd just been handed more than he'd intended to accept. "You made a copy." "I made two," Elena said. "Crane in Cheyenne has the other." The silence that followed that statement had a particular quality that Silas recognized, the quality of someone understanding that the walls they'd been counting on had been measured and accounted for before they'd even been approached. They drove home without much talk, and that evening Silas split wood longer than he needed to, the way he did when his mind was working somewhere behind his hands. And Elena sat on the porch steps with her knees up and watched the valley go dark, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that they'd done everything they could do, and now it was in the hands of a careful sheriff and a territory that moved slow, and there was nothing left but to wait. The waiting was 8 days, and on the 9th day Coombs rode out himself, which told Silas something before the man had dismounted. The Hendricks operation in Douglas had records. Supply operations kept records because credit required them, and the record showed 2 commercial-grade lamp oil purchases in June, both billed to an account in the name of a man called R. Fording, which was Critch Fording's given initial and family name, and the Fording account had an address on the Holloway Range. The Douglas sheriff had pulled the record at Coombs' written request and sent it back with an affidavit from the Hendricks clerk identifying the mark on the bottom of commercial-grade bottles as the one Elena had described. Coombs had also spoken to Pruitt. Pruitt had denied everything with the practiced ease of a man who'd denied things before. But he'd made one mistake. He'd placed himself on the eastern side of the county on the night of July 10th, visiting a cousin whose name and address he'd given readily because he thought it established an alibi. Coombs had sent a deputy to verify the cousin. The cousin confirmed the visit but put Pruitt leaving by 9 in the evening, which was 3 hours before Silas had smelled smoke. The eastern county line to the Granger barn, on a known trail, was a 2-hour ride. "It's not a confession," Coombs said, sitting at Silas's table with coffee Elena had put in front of him, looking like a man who'd arrived at a place he hadn't meant to go and wasn't sure yet how he felt about it. "But it puts him in the area at the time and ties the supply material to Fording and Fording to the Holloway operation. And when you put that next to the Marsh letter from Converse County..." He stopped. He turned his coffee cup. "I've got enough to pull Pruitt in formally, question him under oath. And Fording, if either of them decides cooperation is in their interest, they'll point at whoever hired them," Silas said. "That tends to be how it goes." Elena had been quiet through this, sitting to Silas's left, her hands folded on the table. "What about the boundary survey?" she said. "The fraudulent filing?" Coombs blinked. This was not what he'd expected the conversation to go. "That's a civil matter, separate from the arson." "It's related. The arson was meant to pressure us into selling the parcel she's been claiming illegally for 20 years. You can't separate the motive from the act." She held his gaze steady. "Our lawyer in Cheyenne has the boundary documentation, the 1867 survey discrepancy, the abandoned homestead filing on the upslope parcel. If the territory court is looking at criminal arson charges, and the underlying motive involves fraudulent property claims, those claims become relevant to the criminal case." She paused. "I'd want you to understand that before you decide how far to take this." Coombs looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who'd spent 11 years making peace with the geography of power in his county, and Elena Granger had just drawn him a new map of that geography, one where the terrain was different than he'd thought, and several of the fixed landmarks were standing on questionable ground. "You've been talking to your lawyer about this," he said. "Extensively." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I'll bring Pruitt in Monday." He brought Pruitt in Monday, and the thing that happened next was not quick or clean or dramatic in the way of stories, because real things rarely are. It took 3 weeks of formal questioning and 2 sessions before the territory magistrate in Cheyenne and a deputy making a second ride to Converse County to take Cal Marsh's sworn statement in person. It took Crane filing a motion that connected the arson investigation to the boundary dispute in a way that forced the territory court to consider both simultaneously, which was the piece Elena had seen from the beginning and had been building toward without ever naming it directly to Coombs, because Coombs needed to walk himself to that door before he'd open it. What broke it was Critch Fording. Fording was not Del Pruitt. Pruitt had the psychology of a man who'd faced consequences before and had calculated that silence was always the better bet. Fording was smarter in some ways and weaker in others, smart enough to have kept records of his own. The specific self-protective record-keeping of a man who understands he might someday need to prove he wasn't the only one who knew things. And weak enough that when the magistrate made it clear that the arson charge was serious and that Pruitt was already pointing fingers, and that whoever cooperated first would be treated differently than whoever cooperated second, Fording made a decision in about 4 minutes. He had 2 letters, written in a hand that Silas identified immediately when the copies came through Crane. The particular looping cursive of a woman who'd been educated somewhere expensive, signed with an initial only but addressed to Fording at the Holloway bunkhouse. The letters didn't say "burn the barn" in those words. They said nothing in those words, but they discussed, in careful oblique language, the desirability of a situation in which the Granger operation became untenable, and they referenced Pruitt by a nickname that Fording confirmed under oath referred to Del Pruitt, and one of them mentioned the timing of winter, the worst weeks when the loss would be hardest, and ended with the line that Crane read aloud in the magistrate's hearing room in Cheyenne with the precise neutral voice of a man letting a document hang itself. "I trust you'll use your judgment about the most persuasive approach." Silas was not in Cheyenne for that hearing. Elena was, because Crane had asked her to be available in case questions arose about the documentation she'd assembled. She'd taken the southbound coach alone on a Tuesday, and Silas had watched it go the same way he'd watched the February coach go, with the same thing behind his ribs that he still hadn't examined properly. She came back on a Friday evening, 2 days earlier than expected, which told him something before she'd said a word. She came up the track in a hired wagon because the coach didn't come back this direction until Saturday, and she climbed down in the yard with her traveling bag and her document case, and Pike made his usual undignified fuss about her return, and she bent and rubbed his ears and then straightened and looked at Silas standing on the porch. "Fording talked," she said. He let out a breath he'd been holding since Tuesday. "Come inside." She told him all of it over supper, the letters, the testimony, the particular moment in the hearing room when Crane had read that final line and the magistrate's face had gone from professionally neutral to something that wasn't neutral at all. She told it factually, in order, the way she always told things, but there was something different in her voice tonight, a tiredness that was different from exhaustion, the particular tiredness of someone who'd been carrying a weight for a long time and had just set it down and was now feeling all the places it had pressed. The magistrate referred it to the territory prosecutor, she said. Criminal charges, arson, conspiracy to commit fraud on the boundary filing, 20 years of false property claims. She was quiet a moment. "It'll take months through the courts, maybe longer, but it's out of our hands now. It's in the territory's hands." "That's where it belongs," Silas said. "Yes." She turned her coffee cup. That gesture. He'd watched her do it 100 times now, and it had stopped being a stranger's habit and become simply hers, a thing as known to him as the sound of her step on the porch boards. Crane says even if she avoids the criminal conviction, even if her lawyers find a way out, the boundary documentation is permanent record now. The fraudulent claim is formally contested and on file. She can't take our line. Whatever else happens, she can't take that. "Then the most important thing is settled," Silas said. Elena looked up from the cup. "I know you don't count things one until they're fully won. I'm counting this one." She studied him a moment, reading the certainty in it, deciding whether to trust it. Then she nodded. The news spread through the county the way news moved out here. Faster than horses, slower than truth, but it spread. By the time the formal charges were filed and a notice appeared in the Cheyenne paper that made its way down the valley, the story had already traveled most of its route by word of mouth. Burkett to Pruitt, to the mill, to the saloon, to every kitchen table in 3 counties. Margaret Holloway had been brought before a magistrate. 2 of her men were cooperating with the territory. Her boundary claims on the eastern range were under formal review. The woman who'd bent the geography of the county to her will for 2 decades was, for the first time, on the wrong side of a record she couldn't revise. The reaction in Cooper's Bend was not uniformly sympathetic to the Grangers, because the county had complicated feelings about Margaret Holloway. She'd done real harm to real people over the years, and she'd also employed half of them at one point or another. But the prevailing mood was something Silas had not anticipated. It was a kind of collective exhale, the sound a room makes when the person everyone's been tiptoeing around finally sits down. Lars Burkett said it plainly, the way Lars always said things. People are relieved. Not happy, exactly. Just relieved. Like they'd been waiting for someone to say out loud that the king's got no clothes, and now someone said it, and it turns out everyone already knew. Elena said it, Silas told him. I know she did. Lars was quiet a moment. There were people, you know, when you came back from Cooper's Bend married, who said things. That she was after your land. That you'd been taken in by a pretty face and a hard luck story. He looked at Silas sideways. I didn't say those things. I know you didn't. But I heard them. I want you to know they're not being said anymore. And the people who said them, some of them have found reasons to come by your place, I'd guess. They had. The visits had started while Elena was still in Cheyenne, cautious at first, practical in their framing. A neighbor asking about hay supply. Another about the grazing arrangements Elena had negotiated with the Burketts that had been quietly discussed and quietly envied. But under the practical frame was something else. The specific social currency of people coming to acknowledge that their read on a situation had been wrong and that the person they'd read wrong had earned something they were only now prepared to give. Elena received each visitor the way she'd received the first ones, with coffee and good listening and almost nothing about herself. She didn't perform graciousness about the shift in how people were treating her, didn't make them pay for the earlier distance with any display of having noticed it. She just opened the door and poured the coffee and asked the practical question, and in doing so made it easier for people to sit down, which was more generosity than most of them deserved and which she gave anyway because withholding it would have cost her more than them. Silas watched this from across the room, or from the yard through the window, more than once. He watched her manage the specific social complexity of being right in a community that had doubted her, and he thought about what it had taken to get here. The 12-mile walk, the dead man's letter, the coffee tin full of chaos, the weeks in records rooms, the notebook built piece by careful piece. He thought about the conditions she'd laid down at the table that first night, before either of them was sure of anything, and how she'd held to every one of them and expected him to hold to his. He had. He knew that. He'd kept every promise he'd made her. He'd worked as hard as she had, every day, whatever the place asked. He'd never once made her feel what he'd told her she wouldn't have to feel. What he hadn't promised, he realized standing in the yard on an August evening with the light coming down gold through the cottonwoods, was anything about what happened after they'd proven what they'd set out to prove. The practical arrangement had held through everything the country had thrown at them. The question that lived now in the space between them, the one that neither of them had put words to, was whether a practical arrangement was still what they had. He went inside. She was at the table, not the account books this time, but the notebook, the evidence notebook. Open to the last page of notes she'd taken in Cheyenne. She was reading it over, and her face had the private expression it got when she thought no one was watching. Something underneath the competence and the control. Something younger and less defended than the woman she showed the world. She looked up when he came in. Lars came by while you were out, she said. I saw his horse. He brought a side of bacon, said Marin sent it. He stood in the kitchen for about 10 minutes trying to say something and then just set the bacon down and talked about the weather and left. The almost smile, the real one, the quick one. I think that was an apology. From Lars, that's practically a speech. She laughed. Actually laughed. Not the almost version, the real thing, and it was not the first time he'd heard it, but it still did something to the air in the room when it happened, changed the quality of it, made the cabin feel like a place where laughter belonged. He sat down across from her. The lamp was between them, and the light was the amber evening kind, and Elena closed the notebook and put it aside and looked at him with her gray, direct eyes. It's not over, she said. The court case, the charges, it'll drag. I know. And the ranch still needs the east fence restrung and the hay storage figured out before October, and the books show we're going to need to make a decision about the north herd before winter. She listed these things not as complaints, but as the contents of her mind, the practical shape of what came next, which was how she always talked about what mattered. I know all that, Silas said. I'm just saying it's not a clean ending. It doesn't go clean. Nothing out here does. He looked at her across the lamp. But we're still here. Place is still ours. Lines on record where we said it was. Man who burned our barn is in front of a magistrate. He paused. That's enough. Elena looked at him. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the church. That last measuring look before the words. The look that was taking stock of something, deciding something. And then she said quietly, not performing it, just saying it the way she'd say anything true. I didn't think it would feel like this. Like what? She seemed to consider how to say it. Like we built something, she said finally. I came here to survive. I made conditions to stay safe. I didn't... She stopped. I didn't expect to care about it. About the place. About whether it stood. She looked down at the table for a moment, then back up. About whether we stood. The lamp burned between them. Outside, Pike was doing something loud and enthusiastic to something in the yard. The east fence needed restringing, and the hay needed solving, and the courts would drag on for months. And in the morning, the work would begin again the same as every morning. And none of that was going to be simple or clean or easy. We stood, Silas said. She held his gaze. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not reaching for anything, not asking anything, just putting it there. The deliberate, uncomplicated gesture of a woman who'd been careful with every word and every action since she'd walked up his track, being deliberate now about this. And the warm weight of it sat against the back of his hand, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them said anything else. Because there wasn't anything else that needed saying right then. The east fence still needed fixing. The hay situation was still unsolved. Margaret Holloway was still fighting in a Cheyenne courtroom with lawyers who cost more than the Granger operation made in a year. But in the cabin, in the lamplight, with Pike's racket outside, and the smell of August through the open window, the two people sitting at the table had stopped being a practical arrangement, and they both knew it. And for the first time since she'd walked 12 miles through the first snow of the season, neither of them was afraid of what that meant. The hand-holding lasted about 30 seconds before Pike came crashing through the door with a dead rabbit he was extremely proud of, and the moment broke the way moments do in real life. Not dramatically, just suddenly, with a large muddy dog demanding acknowledgement for his contribution to the household economy. Elena pulled her hand back to deal with the rabbit situation, and Silas got up to get the dog outside, and by the time order was restored, they were both doing other things, and neither of them mentioned what had happened at the table. But it had happened. They both knew it had happened, and knowing was enough for now, and maybe that was the right speed for two people who'd gotten everything else about their arrangement exactly backward from the usual order. Practical before personal, trust before feeling, the work before the wanting. The east fence got restrung that week. The hay situation got solved the week after, through a combination of Elena's negotiations with two homesteads down valley and a late cutting on the south meadow that Silas had always considered marginal, but that came in better than expected. Once Elena looked at the drainage and made two small adjustments he wouldn't have thought to make. The North Herd decision got made in September, a partial sell-off that hurt in the short term and freed up winter costs in the long, and Elena documented every step of it in the account books with the same meticulous care she'd brought to the evidence notebook, because to her there was no real difference between the two. Both were just records of what was true. The court case in Cheyenne ground on the way Crane had said it would, slow and technical and full of the kind of procedural back and forth that cost money and patience in equal measure. Margaret Holloway had lawyers who knew how to use delay as a weapon, and they used it. There were months where nothing seemed to happen, where the case sat somewhere in the territorial system and Silas and Elena went about their work and didn't talk about it much because talking about it didn't move it. What they talked about instead was everything else. The land. The plans Elena had for the spring planting, the crop rotation ideas she'd been developing from the technical manual she'd read aloud in the evenings, the hay cutting tool they'd need to buy before next summer if her calculations on the South Meadow held, her father's lesson about freight costs finally finding its proper application. The Burkett children, who came around now with the casual frequency of children who'd decided a place was safe, the youngest one in particular, a 4-year-old named Bess, who had appointed herself Pike's personal keeper, and who Elena taught to count using the beans in the supply tin with a patience that Silas watched from across the room and filed quietly in the same place he'd filed the moment at the table. He wasn't good at saying things. He'd never been. Words for the interior kind of things, the things that lived behind the ribs and under the surface. Those had always been difficult territory, more foreign to him than the actual frontier had ever been. He showed what he meant with actions instead, the way men of his particular making tended to, the extra blanket at the start of winter, positioned so she'd find it without ceremony. The way he'd started building the fire so it was properly going before she came down from the loft in the morning. The shelf he put up beside the desk for the document box and the account books and the technical manual because she'd been stacking them on the desk's edge, and he could see it bothered her to have them without a proper place. Elena noticed these things. He knew she noticed because she was Elena and she noticed everything, and because sometimes he'd catch her looking at the shelf or the fire with an expression she'd put away before it could be properly identified. She showed what she meant the same way, through the doing. The coffee that appeared when he was scowling at something he couldn't fix. The way she'd started keeping the good chair by the fire for him in the evenings and taking the desk chair herself, a reversal of the first arrangement that had happened so gradually, neither of them had marked the moment it changed. The night in October when he'd come in from a late check on the stock, chilled through, and found the stove built up and a plate covered with a cloth on the table, and had stood there a moment in the warm room looking at that small, careful thing and felt something in him settle that hadn't been settled in a very long time. They were learning each other the long way, the honest way, the way that doesn't have a shortcut. In November, 14 months after Elena had walked up the track with her carpet bag and her dead father's letter, Crane wrote with news that was not the final resolution, but was something better than nothing. Del Pruitt had entered a formal guilty plea on the arson charge in exchange for reduced sentencing, and his statement under oath named Critch Fording as the co-conspirator and confirmed that the instruction to target the Granger barn had come through Fording from the Holloway operation. The plea was on record. The testimony was on record. Holloway's lawyers had spent 3 months arguing that Pruitt's word was unreliable, and they would keep arguing it, but the boundary fraud case was now proceeding separately and on its own evidence, which required no testimony from anyone, just the documents Elena had found in the Cheyenne records room on a cold February morning 10 months before. Crane's letter said, "The boundary fraud matter is, in my assessment, substantially resolved in your favor at the documentary level. What remains is the court's formal confirmation, which I expect within the next 2 to 3 months. The criminal case against Mrs. Holloway personally will take longer, and the outcome is less certain. She has resources for her defense that we cannot match in kind. But she cannot win back what she has already lost, which is the public record. The territory now knows what she is. That tends to matter more than verdicts in the long run." Elena read this letter aloud at the supper table, the whole of it, straight through. When she finished, she set it down and they sat with it a moment. 2 to 3 months, Silas said, for the boundary confirmation. Yes. And after that, our line is uncontested. After that, our line is uncontested. She smoothed the letter on the table. She might still fight the criminal charges for years. She's got the lawyers for it. But Crane's right. It doesn't matter the way it would have mattered before. The record exists. People know. She paused. Cal Marsh knows. His family knows. Whatever she avoids in a courtroom, she can't make those people know what they know. Silas thought about a 20-year-old in Converse County who'd carried something for 4 years and finally put it down in a sworn statement, and about whether he knew his letter had mattered. "Did you ever write back to him after his statement?" Elena looked up. "Yes. When I was in Cheyenne for the hearing, I wrote him that night at the boarding house." She was quiet a moment. "I told him what his letter had done, that it was the piece that made it a pattern instead of just a complaint, that it mattered." She turned her coffee cup. "He wrote back. He said—" She stopped and something passed across her face, briefly unguarded. "He said his father had been ashamed after the fire, that his father felt like he'd failed by not protecting the place. Cal said he hoped the statement helped fix that somehow, helped change the story of it." She looked at the table. "I thought about my father when I read that, about whether I'd change the story of what happened to him, whether he'd feel like what I did here." She gestured, a motion that took in the cabin and the land and the account books and everything they'd built. "Whether that changes the ending of his story." "It does," Silas said. She looked up. "He asked me to make sure you didn't come to nothing." That was what the letter said. That you were the best of everything he'd ever done and he didn't want it to come to nothing. Silas held her gaze. "Look around. This isn't nothing." Elena was quiet for a moment. Her jaw did the small working movement it did when she was feeling something she wasn't going to let take over the conversation. "No," she said finally. "It isn't." The boundary confirmation came in February, 13 months to the week after Elena had first walked into the Cheyenne land office with her list of questions and her father's cautionary tale about trusting wrong people. The document arrived by post, official and sealed, and Elena opened it at the table with the same careful hands she opened everything and read it through in its bureaucratic language, and then turned it over and set it face down on the table and put her palms flat on the back of it. "That's it," she said. "That's ours." Silas looked at her hands flat on the paper. He looked at her face. "Ours," he said, and the word meant more than the land, and they both knew it. What happened in the following weeks was not a dramatic declaration, because they were not dramatic people. It was a series of small moments that accumulated into a thing larger than any of them individually. The evening, Elena fell asleep in the good chair reading her crop rotation manual, and Silas put a blanket over her instead of waking her, and stood for a moment in the firelight looking at her sleeping face with the book still in her lap, and understood something he should probably have understood months ago. The morning she came down from the loft to find him already at the table, with the account books open, trying to work through a problem with the spring purchasing that he'd usually have waited for her to solve, and she sat down beside him rather than across from him to look at what he'd done, and their shoulders were touching, and neither of them moved away from it. The afternoon Lars Burkett asked Silas how things were going, in the particular tone that meant he wasn't asking about the ranch, and Silas said, "Good," and meant it across every possible interpretation of the question. It was Elena who said it first, which didn't surprise him because she was braver about words than he was when the words mattered. It was a Sunday in early March, one of those clear, hard, bright winter days where the snow on the mountains looked close enough to reach, and they were walking the south fence line together, doing the spring check. And she stopped at the corner post and looked out at the valley below and said, without preamble, the way she said everything important, "I think I love you. I've been thinking about whether to say it, and I've decided I'd rather say it and find out where we stand than not say it and keep guessing." Silas stopped beside her. He looked at the valley, too, for a moment. The thing in his chest that had lived without a name for months had a name now, given to it by her voice, and it was strange to hear it named after carrying it unnamed so long. "You're not guessing wrong," he said. She turned to look at him. Her breath made a small cloud in the cold air. "That's a very Silas way to say it. I've been working up to something better for about 6 months. How much longer do you need?" He looked at her then, her gray eyes and the red the cold had put in her cheeks, and the piece of dark hair the wind had pulled loose from under her hat, and he thought about a creek 12 years ago, and a hand in the dark, and the fire that shouldn't have caught. And he thought about how the things that save your life don't always look like salvation when they're happening. Sometimes they look like a woman walking up a track with a carpet bag and a dead man's letter, and you don't know what you've been given until you've spent a year finding out. "I love you," he said, plain, the way he meant it, without decoration. "I've been building up to better, but that's what it is." She looked at him for a moment with those measuring eyes, and then she did something she rarely did in the open air where anyone could see. She stepped forward and put her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the corner fence post looking out at the valley that was theirs, bought and paid for in every way a thing could be paid for. And the wind was cold and the snow on the mountains was bright, and below them the ranch sat solid and real and genuinely theirs. They stayed like that a while. Then she straightened up and said, "The south post is leaning." And he looked, and it was. And they went back to work. That was how it went for them. Love and a leaning fence post in the same breath, which was the only honest version of love this country allowed, and maybe the only honest version anywhere. Spring came properly in April, and with it the planting Elena had been designing in the margins of her notebooks all winter. She'd done her arithmetic and her research, and she put in more than Silas would have tried alone, more diversified. The crop rotation system from the manual adapted to their specific soil and water. And she tracked every variable in the account books with the precision of someone who understood that feelings about farming were useless if the numbers were wrong. The numbers weren't wrong. She'd made sure they weren't. The hay-cutting tool came in May, paid for with what they'd saved on winter feed because the supply arrangement Elena had negotiated had held. The first cutting on the south meadow was better than the second, which was better than what they'd had before, which meant by the following winter they would owe no one for hay, and the margin that had always been thin would be, for the first time in the ranch's history, something approaching comfortable. Comfortable was not a word Silas had ever applied to his own life before. He tested it occasionally, carefully, the way you test ice, putting a little weight on it, seeing if it held. It held. The Holloway criminal case wound through the territory court for another full year before it reached any resolution, and the resolution was not the clean conviction that would have satisfied a Story's sense of justice. Her lawyers were very good, and the evidence connecting her personally, as opposed to her men, to the arson instruction was indirect enough to argue around. What she received was a civil judgment on the boundary fraud, 20 years of false property claims confirmed by the territory court, a financial penalty that her operation could absorb, but that was publicly documented and legally permanent, and no criminal conviction because the criminal bar was higher and her money was long. Pruitt served 18 months. Fording left the county and was not heard from again in that part of Wyoming. Margaret Holloway herself stayed. That was the thing that might have seemed wrong about the ending if you'd expected the story to produce the kind of justice that tidies everything away. She stayed on her reduced range in her expensive coat, and she passed Silas and Elena in the road in Cooper's Bend twice in the following years and did not stop, and they did not stop either. The land she'd claimed falsely for 2 decades was not given to the Grangers. It reverted to the territory, which was the legal outcome. But it was no longer hers, and that was the part that mattered. What Silas understood in the months and years after was something he couldn't have put into words during the fighting of it, that victory out here rarely looked like defeat. It rarely came with a dramatic collapse, a public shaming, a villain carried off in chains while the good people cheered. What it looked like was a woman who could no longer expand, who'd been stopped, whose next 20 years would be defined by the shape of what she hadn't gotten, rather than the shape of what she had. For a person who'd spent 2 decades treating this county as her private geography to rearrange at will, being stopped was its own particular punishment, slower and more thorough than any court could have ordered. Elena said something about it once, the winter after the civil judgment came down, while she was updating the account books and Silas was oiling the new harness fittings by the stove. She said it in the offhand way she said things she'd been thinking about for a while, like the thinking was done and the saying was just the last step. I don't feel what I thought I'd feel about it being over. What did you think you'd feel? Bigger? Satisfied in some large way? She didn't look up from the books. I feel like I crossed something off a list. Important thing on the list, but still just a thing. She paused. The things that feel large to me aren't the Holloway things. They're the other things. Such as Bess Burkett learning to count to 20 using the bean tin and then announcing it to her entire family like she'd discovered fire. She turned a page. The hay from the south meadow coming in better than the year before. The look on your face when the boundary confirmation came in the mail. She glanced up briefly. The south post we fixed in March. You remember? I said it was leaning. I remember. We fixed it. It'll hold for 20 years. She looked back down. I think about that more than I think about the courtroom, the post holding. Silas was quiet a moment. He thought about what she'd said, the real shape of it, that the small things were the architecture and the big things were just the weather you survived to get back to them. His father had understood something like that. He'd never been able to articulate it, but the man had built his life the same way, one post at a time, one season at a time, not toward a destination so much as toward the next thing that needed doing. Your father would have liked this place, Silas said. Elena went still for a moment, then, yes. He would have been insufferable about the hay margins. He'd have found things to improve. A pause, and her voice had gone softer. He'd have liked you. He'd have made you feel like he barely tolerated you and then bragged about you to everyone he knew. That sounds about right, she smiled. The real one, the full one. The one that came less rarely now. He'd have said, I married someone as stubborn as myself, which he'd have meant as the highest possible compliment. He'd have been right, on both counts, she said, and went back to the books. What the ranch became in the years after was not what the stories usually promise, not a grand empire, not a sprawling monument to perseverance, Not the kind of success that makes people use words like legacy while the person is still alive to hear it and be embarrassed by it. What it became was something quieter and harder to name. It became a place that held. Through 2 bad winters and 1 drought year and 1 cattle sickness that took 3 animals and scared them badly before it stopped spreading. Through the ordinary accumulation of difficulty that frontier life handed out without apology and without pattern, the kind that didn't have a villain behind it, just weather and ground, and the stubbornness required to keep showing up. Elena's crop system became a model that 2 neighboring homesteads adopted after watching their own yields over a few seasons, and she walked them through it at the kitchen table with her account books open, patient and precise, and without any performance of expertise. The Burketts, the nearest and most constant of their community, became something that Silas, who'd never had a word for this kind of thing, eventually just called family, because that was what they were. Lars's oldest boy worked the Granger place 2 summers in exchange for help expanding the Burkett corral. Marin Burkett was the only person Elena ever told, one afternoon over coffee while the men were outside, what those first weeks on the ranch had really been like. The fear under the practicality, the specific loneliness of being in a new place with a man she didn't know, the way she'd organized the coffee tin receipts that first day. Not because she'd needed to, but because organizing something that was chaos felt like the only thing she could control. Marin had listened and said, "You should have told someone. We'd have helped." Elena had said, "I didn't know that yet." That was the truest thing about the early part of it. She hadn't known. She'd come into this territory with her father's broken arithmetic and a stubborn will and not much else. And the knowledge of the land, of the people, of which fights to pick and which tools to use to pick them, had accumulated slowly the only way it can, through time and mistake, and the willingness to keep going when going was hard. Silas thought about this sometimes, in the particular quiet of a winter evening when the work was done, and Elena was at the desk, and Pike was old now and slept more than he chased things, and the cabin held the warmth it held because they'd built it right. He thought about what he would have said if you'd told him, on the morning a woman walked up his track through the October snow, that she was going to change everything. He would have told you he didn't want everything changed. He would have believed it. He'd been wrong, and being wrong about it had been the best thing that ever happened to him. There was an evening in the second autumn after the boundary confirmation and before the civil judgment, when they were sitting on the porch in the late light the way they'd started doing when the weather allowed. The valley was going gold and purple the way it did at that hour in September, and the mountains were showing their first snow at the peaks, and Pike was making one last slow circuit of the yard on his old legs. Elena said, out of a comfortable silence, "Do you remember what you said to me that first night when you made the proposal?" "I said a lot of things that first night. You said you'd work as hard as I did, every day, whatever the place asked. That was the promise you said you could keep." He remembered. "I kept it." "You kept it," she agreed. She was watching the mountains. "I've been thinking about what I would have said if you'd made a different promise. Something bigger. Something about love or forever. Or," she made a small gesture with her hand, the imprecise things. "I think I would have run. I needed the small, honest promise. I needed to see whether you'd keep the small one before I could trust any of it. You told me not to make promises I couldn't keep. You listened." She glanced at him sideways. "Do you know how rare that is? A man who listens to what a woman actually says instead of what he thinks she means? I couldn't afford not to listen. You'd have taken the coffee tin and left." She laughed. "Probably." The laugh settled into something softer. "Thank you. For the small, honest promise, for keeping it." He reached over and took her hand the way he'd taken it in the church, the same care, the same deliberateness, and held it on the porch in the fading light while the valley went dark around them by degrees. "Thank your father," he said quietly. "He sent you here." She was quiet a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, the way it always was, but he knew her well enough now to hear what was behind the steadiness. "I'm going to do that," she said, "every day, for the rest of my life. The only way I know how." She looked out at the land, their land held and proved and documented and real. By making sure what he left me doesn't come to nothing. It hadn't. It wouldn't. The post held, the fence held, the ranch held, through everything the country put at it, not because anything about it was easy or clean or built to any plan that stayed intact from start to finish, but because the two people who'd agreed to make it hold had kept their word to each other when keeping it was hard, and had learned, slowly, sideways, in the way of real things, that a practical arrangement and a love story were not opposites. They were, if you were lucky and honest and willing to do the work, the same story told at different speeds. The light failed on the valley and the stars came up hard and bright the way they did at elevation, and inside the cabin the lamp was waiting to be lit. And tomorrow the fence would need checking, and the accounts would need updating, and the small Burkett girl would come over and instruct Pike on proper rabbit hunting technique for the 14th time. And all of it, the ordinary, the difficult, the stubborn daily accumulation of a life built together, waited on the other side of this moment. Silas Granger, who had spent 12 years learning to live without anything he couldn't afford to lose, sat on his porch with his wife's hand in his and understood that he had, somehow, in the most unexpected way, ended up with everything worth keeping. He held on to it. He intended to for a long time.